30 minutes. Okay.
5 minutes for questions if you want.
So good morning. I'm happy to be here. My name is Dan Quinn. I'm the new corn agronomist at Purdue. I did, yeah. So Bob's still around. He's on halftime, kind of helping me get going, make sure I'm not, making a fool of myself out here. But he's around for the help. I'll be sure to tell him that. But yeah, Bob's on halftime retirement, so he's kind of easing out over the next year, and then I'm moving in. So I've been here at Purdue about 3 months. So if I look kind of lost or deer in the headlights, that's why it's kind of drinking from a fire hose as I get started. But I enjoy it as well. So a little bit about myself: I grew up in Michigan, so this isn't far for me where I grew up. I grew up in Central Michigan, farming family up there, right in between Grand Rapids and Lansing. So a small town. Right off I-96 up there. I did 2 degrees at Michigan State. I usually get some boos when I say that as well. I am a Spartan fan, but I guess I got to get used to being a Boilermaker fan. They do pay me, I guess. But after completion, I did 2 degrees in agronomy, extension, applied research. I worked in sugar beets, potatoes, corn, beans, wheat up in Michigan. Finished at Michigan State, went down to University of Kentucky. I usually get boos after I say that too. Wildcat fan. But I did my PhD down there, worked specifically with corn. So I worked with Chad Lee, their extension corn agronomist down there for 3 years, did a lot of trials across the state, especially in cover crops and corn. So if you have any questions on that later in the day, let me know. But I was hired in this job about over a year before I even finished my PhD. So I was pretty fortunate to have that aspect. They kind of held this position for me, and I was able to come in about 3 months ago, moving into Indiana. So I've been above the state, been below the state, excited to be here and learn from you all in this state. This kind of portion of the state is kind of familiar to me with being from Michigan and working a lot in Michigan as well. But happy to be here. We're working on getting a lot of research up and going. So I'll be around through lunch. If there's things that you want to see Purdue do, or there's things that you say, man, I wish Purdue looked at this, or, why haven't you researched this? Or I think Purdue's crazy when they talk about this. Let me know. That's important for me as I get started, things to think about as we get research up and going. Anybody wants to do, research with the university, let me know. I like to do a lot of on-farm trials. Tailored it to your farm and looking at research, and we'll do a lot of the work for you. You'll do obviously the planting and that work for you, but we can do a lot of the data and sampling and stuff like that. So throw that out there. One thing I like to point out to everybody is my information specifically. So I have my information. Feel free to take a picture of this if you want. I'm still waiting on business cards from the university, but I've got my office phone, my email. Send me an email anytime if you have any questions. The more questions you ask, the more I learn when I get started. Still a lot I have to learn. My website, so thekernel.info right here. That's my website. Feel free, hopefully you can check that out, bookmark it. So Bob had the Chat and Chew Cafe for a really long time. It's a really prevalent website that everybody uses. As soon as I got here, what about the Chat and Chew Cafe? That's what I got asked. So I actually took the liberty to actually make my own website, update it a lot, make it, really mobile friendly for a lot of folks, but that is thekernel.info, I-N-F-O is the domain. But there I have all the articles that Bob has written throughout the years. I have the articles that I've been writing as I get started here as well. I also have a lot of the information from other universities, so Michigan State, Ohio State, Kentucky, Illinois, a lot of those, Iowa, a lot of those different universities. I update that every week. I also have an email list too. If you want to be on the email list, I'd send that out every week. Just send me an email, let me know you want to be on that email list. That's something that I'll send out every week. New information from Purdue and a lot of the other universities. So I have a lot of USDA resources on there, weather resources, links to everybody else at Purdue, links to a lot of other folks around the Midwest. So I'm trying to update that every week and add more and more information so you all can use that website. It really centers around what Bob has been doing for so many years and what so many people have relied on. So I want to keep that going. But I kind of want to, personalize it a little bit for me as I get started at this university. But I put that out there, save that, bookmark that page, send me an email if something doesn't work, you want to see something on the website, something you don't see, let me know. It's a continual process of getting that updated. So with that, I kind of talked to a lot of the other groups specifically on the crop report that came out. So last week I was down at the state fair. We got the crop report and actually did a little discussion on that. So 194 bushels per acre. That's what the USDA says. I've had a lot of farmers tell me that USDA is always accurate. They know exactly what they're talking about. So 194. No? Okay. But 194 bushels, that stood out to me because that's high. That's the highest August crop report yield prediction that USDA has ever given the state of Indiana. That's pretty indicative of how good the crop is in this state. Really good yield potential and really strong corn across the state. I've traveled all the way from North Fort Wayne down to Posey County to the eastern part of the state. Corn for the most part looks really good. And I'm interested, I'm gonna be around here this morning and through lunch to hear from you all. I try to get a pretty good indication of what corn looks like and what you expect your yields to be moving forward. But 194 bushels, state record, it's really high. One thing with that number is I always will believe it when I see it, when those numbers come in. But we actually took crop condition ratings, so we've had really good crop condition ratings, pretty stable crop condition ratings throughout this year. So we're at about, I think it fell a little bit, 72% good to excellent, but it's hovered around that 70 to 75% good to excellent throughout this year. I pulled every single year back to, I forget when they started doing this, the condition ratings back in the 80s, I think. Every single year that we had those crop condition ratings up in those 70s, yield was above trend. So trend yield, I think, you calculate trend yield, what we expect based on this graph here is that yield should be about 187, 88, or 178, 79 bushels per acre. So 194 bushels per acre is above trend. Every year in the past that's had similar crop condition ratings have been above trend as well. So we kind of predicted it would be about 190, 191. But it's a high number. Believe it when I see it, when numbers start coming in, when combines start rolling. But overall, from what I can see, a lot of parts of the state, that corn looks really good. I think for the most part, it looks a little bit better than the soybeans. Soybeans probably got hit a lot more from the saturated conditions than the corn did. But there's pockets of corn that had saturated conditions, especially in this part of the state, northern part of the state. Had some issues there. I seen some fields when I was driving up here from Lafayette. But overall, across the state, it looks pretty good. And I think that's a good indication for the state of Indiana. So Indiana was second behind Illinois in the entire Corn Belt, what they predicted yield. You look at Iowa, the Dakotas, really bad. Minnesota, southern Minnesota, parts of Wisconsin as well. Their yields are actually down. So the national yield average of corn is actually down a little bit this year. So I always say, if you have good yields in your state, you hope you have bad yields in a lot of the other states. That's good for the state of Indiana. So hopefully that, some of those states that have been experiencing pretty extreme drought, I feel bad for those folks in those states, but hopefully that can kind of keep some of that overall production down a little bit, and the Indiana production will be up, hopefully this year. But I put this graph up here. I can do a little history lesson. I got to teach a class at Purdue, so this is good practice for me. But we tracked historic yields. The USDA tracks historic yields throughout the state of Indiana. And what's pretty interesting is they started tracking yields about 1866, so way before my time. But 1866 to about 1936, so about 70 years, yields were pretty stable. It's a pretty flat line. Yields hovered around a little bit less, I think they're about 35, 40 bushels per acre. 70 years, pretty straight, pretty flat line. It's just, you look at the resources we have, synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, that kind of stuff. They just didn't, mechanization, equipment, they just didn't have that back then. And also open pollinated hybrids, or not hybrids, open pollinated corn before hybrids. 1866 to 1936, yield was pretty stable. 1936 to about 1956, that's when hybridization or hybrid corn came in. So as soon as hybrid corn was developed and we had hybrids, yield started improving about 0.8 bushels per year. So that's this little time period, kind of right in here. That's kind of the first, they always talk about the first miracle that happened in corn, 0.8 bushels per year. From about 1957 to now, yield's been increasing about 2 bushels per year. That's pretty significant. Just done a a lot of the farmers here today, that's pretty indicative of what you all do. You produce very good corn, and it continues year after year. every single year. And so I put this number, 194 bushels per acre. It's kind of really a little bit above trend, but really on that same trend of 2 bushels per year, where we keep increasing yield every single year. But from about 1956 up to till now, you think about post World War II, that's when synthetic fertilizers started coming in. Different herbicides started coming in as well at that time. Mechanization of equipment started coming in then. So the continual improvement of hybrids at that time too. So, as more and more technology starts coming out and we manage that crop more and more, hopefully we can keep yield increasing on that linear trend. More land isn't coming, land is actually shrinking, but we still do a pretty good job, and hopefully we can keep it that way. But whether or not we'll actually need a third miracle. Genetic modification of crops has helped that. We haven't really seen when genetic modification of crops actually came in, actually really improve that 2 bushels per year. But I like to point that out, looking at that historical yield data. Any questions, concerns on the yield, the crop report? I would say 194 bushels state record yield. I don't know if that means anything with me just starting here. But hope maybe it's setting the bar too high, but I've been pretty fortunate where most of the corn looks pretty good across the state, especially my first year. So with that, I kind of want to move into specifically kind of that kernel weight or that kernel fill period. So a lot of the corn here, pulling ears here, is about R3. There'll probably be some corn in R4, really that milk and dough stage. But I really wanted to focus in on specifically that R5 or that dent stage. Specifically. So really that last 30 days of a corn plant's life, so from R5 to R6, physiological maturity or black layer, it's usually about 30 to 33 days. It can depend on conditions and hybrids and such. From about R5 to R6, if you look at specifically this column is total dry matter in that kernel. So right when full dent occurs, when the corn plant is at that dent stage, starting out at dent, only about 45% of its kernel weight is there. That tells me it's still got about 50 to 55% of its kernel weight left to go. Even though it's at R5, a lot of times I've heard people say R5, that corn plant, that yield's made, it's good, you don't have to worry about it anymore. That's not always true. There's a lot of yield left to be made. There's instances where if you have complete plant death right before R5 or up at R5, it actually can impact yield upwards of 40%. That's just indicative of that kernel weight. Kernel weight is really important. It's one of the main yield components. If you have poor kernel weight, you can actually decrease your yields pretty significantly. So that's something to point out. Even though we're at R5, there's still time to go. So if you have nitrogen stresses, moisture stresses, if you stop irrigation too early, it gets too dry, it can really impact specifically that kernel weight. Another thing to point out, especially at R5, is looking at the milk line. So if you split a ear in half, and look at those kernels and look where that milk line is, right when you're at full dent, it's really important to pay attention to where that milk line is because it can tell you a lot. At full dent, that corn ear moisture is about 60%. We're about 45% total dry weight. Took about 75 growing degree days throughout the entire first full dent stage. And it lasts about 3 days. But that's when that milk line hasn't really been established. You look at quarter milk line. So that milk line is actually moved about a quarter. So the milk line is actually the difference between that hardened starch in that kernel and more of that doughy or milky starch in that kernel. So it's just showing you how much that kernel is progressing and starting to dry down and also fill kernel weight at that time period. So quarter milk line, that percent moisture moves down about 52%, and also total dry weight is up to about 65%. So it's determined about 65% of its weight. One thing we point out is half milk line. So that milk line is about halfway down in that kernel. This is where we're really close to determining full yield. So in about 90% of your kernel weight is determined when that half milk line has occurred. So if we have stresses, that occur, up here, right when dent starts, quarter milk line, you have stresses, poor conditions during those periods, is that you'll end up losing a lot more yield than when you're at half milk line and all the way down. But just paying attention to that where that milk line is, it gives you a good indication of when physiological maturity will occur in that corn plant, when black layer will occur. 3/4 milk line, then we're down about 37% moisture. We're about 97% kernel weight. So we're just about full kernel weight and physiological maturity. That's when that corn plant is done. Get that black layer. As it cuts that kernel off from the cob, it's no longer receiving any more photosynthetates. Corn plant's done. That kernel is done. I think this is really important for this year, is to really look at kernel weight, and hopefully we have good conditions during this time period. You know, you think about poor moisture conditions. Hopefully, you know, a lot of the corn I've seen still isn't really running out of nitrogen. There's certain areas. Disease could potentially impact some of this, as well as you're losing some of that photosynthetic area. One thing with a corn plant is you look at the top leaves of that corn plant, that's where about 60 to 70% of those photosynthetates are coming from to fill that ear. So it's important to really kind of keep that upper canopy green, healthy, moving forward, and fill some of these kernels. 2 is also temperature as well. So one thing we really pay attention to during the grain fill period is nighttime temperatures. I would say corn plant's kind of like me at night. You know, it gets above 70, 75 at night. You know, you got to have the AC on to sleep good. Corn plant's kind of that way. You know, if it starts working pretty hard at night, that respiration rates go up, just works a lot more at night, burns a lot more energy, and can really impact some of that kernel fill. And 2, if you have lower temperatures, it actually extends that grain fill period. So longer grain fill period, the corn plant can stay a little bit greener longer. You can actually fill kernels a lot better. One thing that we're kind of paying attention to this year is that we had really good conditions for the most part, you know, really good soil moisture conditions during pollination. And really right after that kernel is pollinated, there's kind of a lag phase in there that actually occurs where that kernel, basically that ear, that corn plant determines how big that kernel is. So I think with those good conditions, hopefully we see a lot of larger kernels. You know, that can also be hybrid dependent as well, but hopefully we have a lot of larger kernels out there. When you have larger kernels, that corn plant's got to do everything it can to fill those kernels. In order to fill those kernels, kernels are sinks. You know, they're sinks, a lot of carbohydrates, photosynthetates that's got to move from that plant to fill that kernels. The corn plant's switching to, I'm going to do everything in my capacity in order to fill those kernels. If you have stresses, if you had, you know, anything that can impact that corn plant even early on during pollination and during these late stages that impacts that photosynthetic capacity of that corn plant, that factory of that corn plant, could potentially impact that kernel weight. So this is something that we like to point out too as well. You know, one thing that really illustrates that, I had the last group, I don't know if we'll have time, this group as well, but I actually went through and, you know, you think about yield estimates. You know, yield estimates, a lot of folks are starting to do yield estimates, especially when you get kind of that R4, R5 growth stage, you start doing a lot of yield estimates. And one thing with yield estimates is it can really show you how important kernel weight is. So I went out here, I've got my tape measure out, measured out. These are 30-inch rows of corn. So I got my tape measure out, measured out 17.4 feet. So 17.4 feet is 1,000th acre. So I counted about 36 plants in that 1,000th acre, indicates about 36,000 plants per acre is what was our final population. So you count the number of ears in that 17.4 feet, you get out your basically pull 5 ears and kind of pull the average of kernel numbers. So you count the rows around and then the kernels up. I'm sure many of you all know that. But you think about that specific calculation for determining grain yield. So we have the number of ears in that 17.4 feet, so 36. You think about kernel number per ear, and I'll get my calculator out here. You know, we counted some of those earlier. They're right around 600 kernels per ear. That's on average. So you multiply that by 36. It's 21,600. And does anybody can tell me what number I divide by to get final grain yield? Anybody? A lot of them are using 90. Yep. So if I divide by 90, 240 bushels per acre. That's the yield estimate. Does anybody know why they use 90?
Kernel size is a lot bigger.
Yeah. So kernel size can actually, and that's actually can be determined on kernel weight as well. So 90, they use 90 because determines there's 90,000 seeds per 56-pound bushel. That's a good exercise to actually look at the differences in kernel weight. So actually in the Corn Belt, it can range from anywhere from 75,000 all the way up to 95,000. That's kind of pretty average. It can even go up to 100,000 some years, or even go lower than 75. But that shows you, so if I had, you know, let's see here, we had 36 times 600 divided by 90, 240 bushels per acre. If I divide by, you know, say 75, 288 bushels per acre. So just on that difference of kernel weight or kernel size of those corn plants, how much that impacts yield. If you haven't used that number 75 or use 90, really indicative on that kernel weight, can impact yield, you know, anywhere from 30, 40 bushels. But usually we use 90. It's a good exercise that I like to look at, and look at the importance of kernel weight and how that can actually impact yield. Just because that corn plant's at R5, still got a lot of time to go. Still a lot of yield left to be made, a lot of weight left to be made, but it's a good exercise to look at that. Any other questions? Any questions for me? Questions on anything? Yes, sir.
Yeah, a week ago, east of here, we had a hail event, and leaves are in,
Yep.
but they're some of them are at 2 or 3 pieces. How much effect is that going to have with that?
Do you know what growth stage it was at?
A little farther along than this.
Farther along, so it'll actually be a lot lower than you actually think it will be. So there's actually a specific table that the crop insurance folks use, and if the leaf is still intact, they actually don't count that as defoliation. So it's still photosynthesizing, it's still attached, it's still contributing to that corn plant. And as you get into these later growth stages, even complete defoliation can actually impact yield, you know, pretty low. If it's during pollination, so R1, right when it's tasseling, you can lose a significant, you know, 60, 70% yield, significant amount of yield. But the later we get in the season with that hail damage, and if those leaves are still attached, I expect that yield loss. You might have some, but it should be pretty low. Other questions, concerns? Questions on anything? You know, as a new guy, the more questions I get, the more I learn. So. How was Joe? Yes, sir.
Seed corn, if those top leaves are so darn important, what makes sense that you cut the whole top of the plant off?
You know, that's a good question. I wish I had the answer for you. You know, I think they mainly just, if there's any seed corn folk that are here that could maybe answer that question a lot better. But from what I know, usually that top part of the plant contributes about 50-60% of the photosynthase to that plant. I think it probably just comes back to getting that tassel off of those corn plants as well. But that's a good question. You know, I wish I had a lot better answer for you. Why they specifically do that, I'd be interested to see why they specifically do that for sure.
Guys might not want 90 bushel, 90 pound seed bags either.
Yeah, sure.
Viable seed.
Okay, yeah, so that's probably a good point too. They're maybe more actually looking at a viable seed quality more so than specific yield in those seed corn fields. Yeah. Any other questions, concerns? You know, one thing we also kind of point out to, and I've been telling folks that we've kind of been tracking a little bit this year, is solar radiation in the air. So especially this part of the state, you think about the northwest part of the state, had a lot of wildfires. Western part of the state up into Canada, a lot of smoke, especially in this area. We've had a lot of hazy days. There's basically an article that came out of Ohio State really last week that actually tracks, you know, photosynthetic active radiation or light intensity of that corn crop this year compared to the last 4 years, and it was actually significantly lower this year. So that's something that we are kind of a little bit concerned about, and also something that we pay attention to. So we had some areas where we had consecutive cloudy days during pollination, and also had a lot of hazy days, had some smoke, some air quality issues as well, and that really impacts the light intensity of that corn crop. It's something that's really difficult to study. I wish there was a way to study, you know, smoke, and because I think, you know, moving forward, probably just if things get dry in the western part of the state or the western part of the country, you know, in parts in Canada, they actually track the amount of wildfires that we've had in the last 40, 50 years, and it increases every single year. So I think that's something to pay attention to, those air quality issues. So that could impact corn yield. You think about the photosynthetic capacity of that corn plant. Anything that impacts the amount of photosynthase that that plant can acquire impacts yield. You think about a corn stalk later in the season. So this corn stalk looks pretty good. It's pretty white. You know, there's not any of that kind of that strapping or any disease in there as well, but this is something we kind of pay attention to. When you have stresses during the season, you know, stuff that impacts that photosynthetic capacity of that corn plant. When that corn plant switches to, I'm going to do everything in my power to fill those corn plants, it really will do everything in its power to fill those corn kernels and even cannibalize itself. If it doesn't have enough photosynthase in that plant, it's going to start pulling them from the lower portion of the stalk. It's going to start pulling carbohydrates from this lower part of the stalk and move them up to that ear. And if that plant just didn't have, you know, had certain stresses, if we had, you know, areas where we got poor photosynthesis, we just didn't have enough carbohydrates or sugars or photosynthase in that plant, it starts pulling from that lower area of that stalk. When it starts pulling from that lower area of the stalk, it basically cannibalizes itself. This lower stalk area, actually you can see it, it'll start to get brown. It's kind of some of the strapping in there. I don't know if there's a better word for that, but the health just doesn't look very good. When the health is not very good, that's where diseases can move in. So if you have poor stalk quality, diseases can come in. Some of those stalk diseases can come in. And also too, some of that corn plants can lodge. You know, I think that's, you know, fairly rare that happens, but it's something to be mindful of as well. You know, we always talk that you walk horizontally into your cornfield and just pushing on corn plants. You know, as you move corn plants out of your way, as long as they're still, you know, have good stalk strength, you can kind of tell that way. But if they're starting to fall over a little bit, something to pay attention to. You actually could split some stalks. Look at that stalk health. Look at that quality. But it's something to be paying attention to. You know, if we did have a lot more, you know, hazy days or smoke, air quality issues that really impacted that photosynthesis of that plant, a lot more. And you think about these corn plants, there's a lot of potential out there. You know, a lot of potential. And that corn plant's probably doing everything in its power to fill those kernels, fill those ears, and whether or not it's actually going to impact some of that stalk quality. Something to pay attention to moving forward. Yes, sir.
Where are we at on growing degree days versus normal this year?
That's a good question. I haven't specifically looked at those specific numbers. I think about, for the most part, we've had some warm days in there, but I think we're probably average or maybe a little bit lower because we've had stretches where it's been kind of cool.
Our corn though planted kind of historically when we begin the year seems to what it normally is.
This year?
Yeah, we're in full den.
Full den, really?
112 to up to 114 day corn.
Okay.
And we're like, oh, really?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's really moving, and we've really never heard moisture.
Yeah.
So it's just, you know, we're trying to figure it out. But
Yeah, no, that's something that,
it's gonna be way early in our area.
sure. No, that's good for me to know. I appreciate that. That's something that I need to look at closer. But it could potentially, I know we've had some timely planting. Was it planted earlier this year? Then no, it wasn't. Okay.
Last week, April, first week in May.
Okay. And whether or not it came back to some of the, I think it got pretty warm early on. It was actually dry early on.
We were really warm in July. And June too.
Yeah. So I think June, July may have progressed that corn plant really quick. I think recently, kind of the beginning of August, late July, it actually cooled down a little bit, maybe slowed some things down. But yeah, that's good to know. Yeah. Other questions? I don't know how we're doing on time. 4 minutes. Yes. That's the hot topic, you know, and Darcy's on this tour as well, and she's got more answers than I do. But that's something that we watch. It's here. It's in a lot of counties. Darcy does a really good job of tracking exactly where that disease in the state at basically every week, where that disease is in the state. You know, one thing that we're really trying to pinpoint exactly is, okay, I sprayed at R1. Okay, do I need to come back for a second one? You know, how late is too late when we spray? You know, with tar spot being a newer disease, it actually is something that we're still studying. They talk about, I talked to Darcy a little bit, they're talking about with the second spray, you get into R4, pushing R5, that second spray really doesn't impact yield and doesn't, they talk about save your dough. When you're in R4 dough stage, you save your dough. You know, don't apply that second fungicide. But if you're in that R2, R3, you know, that first fungicide, you know, some of those fungicides may only last 25, 30 days. It might actually be beneficial to come back. I know they've seen tar spot in areas, you know, even further south than they've seen it before. Just some of these, you know, those high humidity days, this continual leaf wetness, you know, it's been a little bit dry in spots that have helped with that. But it's out there in a lot of counties. Certain irrigated areas, and especially this part of the state, is kind of, I think, kind of ground zero for tar spot as well. But you know, Darcy on the tour here today, she has so many trials on tar spot. That's something they watch so much, and trying to learn even more on that. But I know that first fungicide spray, that R1, and then actually when you get into R5. You know, late R4, R5, usually that second fungicide spray doesn't pay at all. We just don't see any yield benefit from it. But she'll for sure talk, I'm sure she'll talk a lot more about that. Yeah, looks like I'm good. I'll be around this morning, lunch. You know, if you need my information or email or phone number, let me know. But thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah.